Well, good morning. The theme I want us to explore today is being locked down but not knocked down. One of the most famous boxing matches ever was between the legendary Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in Zaire, titled The Rumble in the Jungle. Muhammad Ali was coming to the end of his distinguished career, and here was this up-and-coming, remarkably gifted boxer, George Foreman. And he was a huge bull of a man, so powerful. Ali, we know, is famous for moving like a butterfly and stinging like a bee. But for 7 rounds, he couldn't move and he couldn't sting. He was up against the ropes and pinned down in the corner. And Foreman just landed punch after punch, withering blows. And Ali, all he could do was just cover up and soak it up. I think any one of those punches would have put me on the floor. But Ali was able to stay standing. He was locked down, but he was not knocked down. And then remarkably, in the 8th round, Ali comes off the ropes. He comes out of the corner and still standing, still strong, he dances like a butterfly, stings like a bee. And in just a few well-chosen punches, Foreman, whose energy had just been spent, he himself hits the floor, down and out, and the fight goes to Ali. Well, this week I've been reading through the book of Acts, and in chapter 24, verse 27, we read that Paul, having been arrested for inciting trouble in Jerusalem, was kept in jail in Caesarea, which is a major port in Israel under Roman occupation, and he was kept there for 2 years by the Roman governor Felix. 2 years. After that confinement, he was taken to Rome and there imprisoned for another 3 years under house arrest until his eventual martyrdom. But I'd never noticed this before, even though I've read it numerous times, a 2-year lockdown of Paul in Caesarea. And there's no comment, there's no commentary, no adjectives, no description. It's just presented, matter of fact, there for 2 years. 2 years, Paul was in jail, locked down, but not knocked down. And when the 2 years had passed, Paul is brought before the Jewish king Herod Agrippa. And far from being defeated or deflated, here is a man ablaze. And Luke records Paul's longest sermon in Acts 26, preached before Herod Agrippa. And it's a masterpiece, full of faith and fire, making points of contact with his audience and weaving in testimony and history and Jewish theology and concluding with a final challenge to Agrippa. And it's so powerful and so persuasive that King Herod feels the heat and he protests, "Are you trying to persuade me to be a Christian in such a small time?" Paul, of course, was trying to persuade him. But Paul was a man fully alive and full of the Spirit and full of faith, and his gifts were on display. 2 years locked down, but not knocked down. Faithful, faith-filled, witnessing. 2 years in jail hadn't left him bitter. He hadn't given up on his faith. He hadn't doubted and wondered where God was. He hadn't decided to take a new vocation, but he came out even stronger. 2 years spent with Jesus. What did he do in those 2 years? Well, we don't know. The text moves over it quickly, almost nonchalantly. Maybe he did a few press-ups or a few burpees. I haven't been tempted myself in this shutdown. Perhaps under close house arrest, he could even go for a little walk. I don't know. But some top scholars, New Testament scholars, believe that the letter to the Colossians and Ephesians and Philemon could have been written during this imprisonment in Caesarea. They seem different in both content, and there are various features in them that set them apart from the other letters that we presume were written from imprisonment in Rome. And so despite confinement and discomfort and even threat, Paul is standing firm, and he's also writing and seeking to encourage the church. And it's interesting that both in Colossians and in Ephesians, he returns several times to this theme of standing. In Colossians, he says, stand firm in the faith, not shifting from the gospel. Again, he says, stand firm in the will of God. In Ephesians 3 times, he says, stand, stand, stand against the enemy. He was locked down, but he was not knocked down. Instead, he was standing. And he was locked down, but he was not shut down. He was using that time to be useful and creative and encouraging and writing to these struggling churches to inspire them and help them to stand firm in the lockdown. It's interesting that some great masterpieces of literature have been written in isolation, in prison or during plague. Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the great Arthurian legend, written in prison. Miguel de Cervantes wrote the classic Don Quixote in prison. John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress. Oscar Wilde wrote the deeply moving De Profundis. Ezra Pound wrote Peace and Cantos, which I'd never heard of. Shakespeare wrote King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra during the plague. I've been reading Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison. He was arrested in April 43, executed in April 45 for opposing Hitler. And in these letters and thoughts, still 75 years later, I'm reading them and they're inspiring me. Encouragements of a man who walked with God and sought to love and serve his neighbour. And even from jail was writing to various people and speaking words of encouragement and life. One of the things he wrote that has inspired me says, the church is the church only when it exists for others, not dominating, but helping and serving. It must tell people of every calling what it means to live for Christ and to exist for others. It must tell all people what it means to live for Christ and to exist for others. That's what Paul in lockdown was doing, writing to encourage people live for Christ and exist for others. That's what Bonhoeffer 75 years ago was doing. Well, we're not going to be in lockdown for 2 years, hopefully not for 2 months. But how will your faith be when it's over? What will you do in this time? I want to encourage you to use this time like Paul to enjoy the Lord and to stand firm and strong in the faith and to look for ways that you could perhaps write or send messages, emails, or put the word out there about Jesus, who he is, what he is, and how he is. Get to know him better and get to share him with others. The end of 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea, Paul stands before King Herod Agrippa, and he says this, God has helped me to this day. Up to this very day, God has helped me. And God is helping you, and he will help you, and he will be faithful to you. You're locked down, but you're not knocked down.